It happened in less than 60 seconds. The sky over Highway 17 was a pale, cloudless blue, almost too perfect for what was about to unfold. The black SUV was parked neatly on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking like a quiet heartbeat. Inside sat a man alone, unmoving. His posture was erect, composed. One hand rested on the steering wheel, the other hovered just above the center console where a muted phone buzzed, its screen glowing with the words, "Secretary of Defense, missed call." But Officer Karen Whitmore didn't see the phone. She didn't see the subtle military badge etched into the chrome of the license plate frame. She didn't notice the 4 tiny gold stars discreetly fixed on the dashboard. What she saw was a black man in a late-model SUV. Alone, parked, calm. And that was enough. With her cruiser angled behind him, lights flashing, Whitmore approached with the confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times before, and with the recklessness of someone who'd never stopped to question why. Her voice was already raised before she reached the window. "Step out of the vehicle now. Hands where I can see them." The driver turned his head slowly. His eyes were focused but calm, like he'd seen this exact moment before, perhaps too many times in too many different places. "I'm just adjusting my GPS, officer," he said clearly, his tone professional, almost clinical. "I am Major General Elijah Monroe, and I am on active duty. My ID is in the glove compartment." Whitmore didn't flinch. Didn't ask for documents. She reached for her cuffs. "Out." "Now." "Don't make me repeat myself." A few cars slowed down. One driver pulled over. Another held up a phone, then another, and another. In the age of digital witnesses, reality travels at 60 frames per second. General Monroe stepped out with the same composure he'd shown in combat zones across 3 continents. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't resist. He merely stood tall as Officer Whitmore spun him around and slapped cold metal cuffs around the wrists of a man who held the nation's trust. The crowd murmured. "Is this a joke? That's a general. You can see the stars on his car." She didn't even ask his name. But it didn't matter. To Karen Whitmore, Elijah Monroe wasn't a commander. He wasn't a decorated veteran. He wasn't even a man. He was a threat. And in that moment, on a clear, quiet stretch of highway in North Carolina, a single snap of handcuffs silenced 4 decades of honorable service. What Officer Whitmore didn't know was that those cuffs weren't the beginning of control. They were the beginning of her undoing. And the world was already watching. The cuffs clamped shut with a metallic finality, but General Elijah Monroe didn't resist. Not a twitch. Not a protest. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes from years of walking through war zones where one wrong move meant never coming home. His frame was steady. Shoulders squared, chin high. Not in defiance. No. Monroe wasn't the kind of man who needed to posture, but in quiet resolve. Dignity anchored him like a mountain amidst a storm of ignorance. Officer Karen Whitmore, young, impulsive, and utterly unaware, kept her hand hovering near her holster as if the real danger was the man she just shackled, not the history she was repeating. "I said keep your hands visible," she barked. "They are," Monroe answered, low, controlled, and calm as steel. He offered his ID once more, voice composed, not pleading. She didn't glance at it. Didn't care that the card bore an eagle crest with clearance credentials most agents would envy. She saw only what she wanted to see, a black man in a high-end SUV, parked in the wrong place, looking too calm, too confident. The insignia on his jacket went unnoticed. The 4 golden stars embroidered inside his lapel, symbols earned over decades of service, meant nothing to her. His voice was too measured, his gaze too steady. To her, calm was confrontation. Stillness was threat. "Any weapons in the vehicle?" she demanded. "Only policy," he murmured. Her brow creased. "I'm sorry?" "I said, only policy." "And protocols. I just left the Pentagon." She rolled her eyes. "Yeah, and I'm with the CIA." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. Because men like Elijah Monroe didn't debate with people like Karen Whitmore, he had once de-escalated a hostage crisis in Kandahar using nothing but his presence and patience. He had walked into war rooms where world leaders whispered when he entered. But this roadside scene? This wasn't a battlefield. It was a mirror. A mirror reflecting how invisibility doesn't come from camouflage, but from the color of your skin. The cameras were rolling. Civilians were watching. Some muttered, "That's not right." Others pulled over in disbelief. Still, Monroe did nothing. No sudden movements. No anger, just compliance layered with calculation. Because in America, even a 4-star general has to submit first to survive. The irony? Whitmore thought she was in control. But Monroe had already begun writing the report, in his mind, in his silence, in the precision of every breath he took. This wasn't just another traffic stop. This was data, evidence. Another page in a case study he had been building for 20 years, and Officer Whitmore had just become Exhibit A. The wind shifted on Highway 17. A storm was brewing, but it wasn't in the clouds. General Elijah Monroe stood beside his SUV, cuffs biting into his wrists, as Officer Karen Whitmore circled him like a lioness who believed she had cornered her prey. But prey doesn't stand like this. Calm, unblinking, shoulders back like a statue carved from restraint. "I'm going to ask you one last time," she snapped. "What are you doing here?" Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I am Major General Elijah Monroe," he said evenly, "commanding officer of Fort Hamilton. I just returned from a national security briefing in Washington. My credentials are in the glove compartment." Karen froze for a beat, just long enough for the title to register. General. But then it passed. Her smirk returned. "Sure you are," she said, voice laced with sarcasm. "And I'm the President of the United States." The words weren't just dismissive, they were dangerous. They revealed the root of everything happening at that moment. Not fear, not protocol, but disbelief. Disbelief that a black man could hold that much power. "I'm not joking, officer," Elijah replied, voice firm but level. "I'm currently tasked with overseeing active defense operations in the southeast region." Her hand hovered near her holster again. "I don't care what kind of fantasy you're selling. You fit the description of someone reported acting suspiciously in this area. That's enough for me." Behind them, traffic had slowed. A man leaned out of his truck window, filming. A woman shouted from her sedan, "You know who that is? That's a general." Karen ignored them. Elijah stayed silent. Then, buzz. From the SUV's dashboard, a phone lit up. The name on the screen burned through the glass. Sec of Defense. Incoming call. Karen didn't notice, or if she did, she ignored it. The phone went unanswered. The line disconnected. The opportunity to stop the avalanche was missed in a heartbeat of arrogance. "I'm telling you," Elijah repeated, "this is a mistake. A grave one." Karen leaned in, inches from his face. "You don't get to tell me what a mistake is," she hissed. "Step back. We're going to search the vehicle." And just like that, the power dynamic shattered, not in law, but in perception. Because while Karen held the cuffs, Elijah held the weight of decades of authority and sacrifice, and she had just dismissed it all with a smirk. That call from the Secretary of Defense? It wasn't a routine check-in. It was a thread that, once pulled, would unravel everything she thought she understood about power, command, and the price of blind judgment. She just didn't know it yet. The cell was small, sterile, and deliberately suffocating. Gray concrete. Flickering fluorescent lights, a single bolted chair. General Elijah Monroe sat in it, like a man attending a board meeting, not a holding cell. No slouching, no pacing, no visible tension. He simply watched, listened, recorded. Every creak of a shoe, every muttered joke, every careless name that drifted through the air like a secret no one thought they'd have to answer for. He noted the crooked patch on one deputy's shoulder, the coffee-stained report in the lieutenant's hand, and the chipped acrylic on Officer Karen Whitmore's fingernail as she anxiously fidgeted with her belt. Monroe wasn't detained. He was collecting intelligence. Across the hall, behind a pane of two-way glass, Karen stood with her arms folded and a nervous edge in her posture she hadn't yet named. She told herself it was nothing. The man was a fraud. Probably some washed-up veteran clinging to old stories. That's what she told herself. But deep down, something was off. He didn't behave like a suspect. He didn't ask questions. He didn't raise his voice or demand a phone call. He simply waited, with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing exactly how long it takes for a system to expose itself. Shattered. Mills leaned closer to the glass, chewing on a pen cap. "You run the ID yet?" Karen shrugged, eyes fixed on Monroe. "Still waiting on clearance." "Doesn't matter. He lies about his identity, and he holds back something. You can feel it." "You sure it's not the other way around?" Karen didn't answer. On the other side, Monroe adjusted in his seat, just slightly, enough to tilt his wrist and glance at the ticking clock. 2 hours. No phone call, no Miranda rights properly issued, no official verification of his identity. It was no longer just procedural failure, it was a pattern. A silent file was building in his head, not just for him, but for every person like him who had ever been reduced to a threat instead of a title. Then it came. Ring. The shrill landline on Karen's desk sliced through the station like a bullet through glass. She grabbed it without thinking. "Officer Whitmore speaking." There was a pause, then her eyes changed. A beat. Then her mouth tightened. The hand holding the phone began to tremble. "Yes, sir, right away." She hung up, slower than she picked up. "Shirter." Mills raised an eyebrow. "Problem?" "That was Deputy Chief Ramirez," she said quietly. "He's en route, with 2 federal agents." "And a colonel." "Colonel from where?" Karen didn't answer immediately. "Fort Hamilton." The words dropped like a stone. "Friend." Mills blinked. "Wait, Fort Hamilton? As in Joint Operations Command?" Karen nodded. "Once." Behind the glass, Monroe didn't smile, but he did lean back just a little, reclaiming space that had never truly been taken from him. His hands remained cuffed, but the room no longer belonged to them. It belonged to him. He knew what was coming. The storm had been summoned, and she had pulled the trigger. The woman who thought she'd stopped a suspect had, in fact, activated the most important case study in modern law enforcement history. She just didn't know her name would be on the first page. The automatic doors of the Ravenwood police station flung open with a force that turned every head in the room. 3 figures entered. None of them smiled. At the front was Colonel Michelle Barnes, in full dress uniform, her medals clinking softly with each purposeful step. Flanking her were Special Agent Ryan Delaney of the Department of Homeland Security and Intelligence Officer Kira Morgan, her federal ID already drawn. They didn't wait at the front desk. They didn't ask for directions. They already knew where to go. Behind the glass in the observation room, Officer Karen Whitmore stood frozen, her mouth dry. The color had drained from her face the moment the word "Colonel" was spoken. But now she felt the full weight of her decision descend like a concrete wall pressing into her chest. Colonel Barnes approached Deputy Chief Ramirez, who had rushed down from headquarters minutes before. "Where is he?" Barnes asked without preamble. Ramirez, pale and sweating, motioned to the holding cell. Karen opened her mouth to explain, justify, and reach for any scrap of protocol she could hide behind. But the colonel cut her off with a single look. "Elijah Monroe is the current commanding general of Fort Hamilton," Barnes said, voice steady but sharp. "He holds Alpha 9 clearance. He is briefed daily on matters of national security that do not leave that building without presidential authorization. And today Officer Whitmore, was en route to finalize the congressional submission of the Monroe Police Reform Initiative." Karen blinked. I didn't know." "No," Barnes snapped. "You didn't care." She turned to the officers beside her. "Get him out of that cell." Now. The sound of keys rattling through the air was the only answer. Inside the cell, Elijah Monroe stood before the door that had not been opened. His expression was unchanged, serene, composed, but in his stillness was the quiet force of an earthquake waiting for permission to move. "General Monroe," Barnes said as the cuffs were removed, "on behalf of the Department of Defense, I offer our sincerest apologies for this unacceptable incident." He gave her a small nod, then adjusted his uniform blazer with deliberate calm. The room was silent as he turned to Karen. Her eyes were down. Her stance was unsteady. He walked past her, then stopped. "Officer Whitmore," he said, his voice smooth but ringing like a gavel. "You asked me earlier if I had anything important in that vehicle." She didn't answer. "I do." He turned slightly, just enough for the whole room to hear. "In the back seat is a locked briefcase containing final drafts of a national proposal, the Monroe Protocol, a framework for racial bias training, standardized civilian encounter policies, and mandatory accountability measures for law enforcement nationwide." Karen's eyes lifted, just enough to meet his. "I was scheduled to present it before Congress next week," he said. "But thanks to you, I now have a perfect case study to lead with." The air left the room. Everyone knew what he meant: the arrest, the mishandling, the indifference, and the cameras. So many cameras. The footage was already online, already viral, already dissected by millions. Karen took a shaky breath. "Sir, This isn't about me," he said, cutting her off, calm as ever. "This is about the system that built you, and didn't bother to question whether you were ready for the power it gave you." He looked around. Officers, clerks, agents, all watching. "I'm not just someone who was arrested today," Monroe said, louder now. "I am data. I am evidence. I am the living report this country has tried to ignore." He paused. "But now the story writes itself." With that, he turned to Colonel Barnes and walked alongside her through the hall, each step a silent verdict, each silence a new headline waiting to be written. And behind them, Karen Whitmore was no longer the officer in control. She was a lesson. A line in a report. A name in a footnote of the very reform she tried to deny. The walls of the Pentagon's hearing chamber had seen war plans, classified intelligence briefings, and emergency declarations. But they had never seen a hearing quite like this. At the head of the room sat 3 U.S. Senators, Abigail Grant of Illinois, Martin Cross of Virginia, and Diane Yoon of California. Flanking them were the Attorney General, a man known more for sharp interrogations than compassion, and the Director of Civil Rights, whose very presence signaled that this was no longer just a military matter. This was a national reckoning. The cameras were off. The room was closed to the press. But the world would hear about this sooner than anyone in that room realized. At the center, sitting with immaculate posture despite the visible bruising around his wrists, was General Elijah Monroe, a man who, just days earlier, had been thrown against the hood of his own car by a local police officer who couldn't see past her assumptions. He adjusted the microphone. His military uniform was perfectly pressed, 4 gold stars gleaming against the deep navy fabric like they were daring anyone to underestimate him again. Senator Grant leaned in. "General Monroe, for the record, could you recount the events that led to your detainment?" He nodded once. No emotion, just facts. "I was en route from Washington, D.C. to Fort Hamilton after a classified security meeting. I pulled over to reprogram my GPS. Moments later, Officer Karen Whitmore of the Ravenwood Police Department approached me with her weapon partially drawn. Despite identifying myself as an active duty general and presenting military credentials, I was ordered out of the vehicle, searched, handcuffed, and detained. Senator Yoon frowned. "And you did not resist?" "I complied fully," Monroe said. "Because I've learned that when you are black in America, compliance is not submission, it's survival." A quiet fell over the room. "I've spent decades teaching soldiers how to de-escalate hostile encounters in foreign territories," he continued, "but nothing in my training could prepare me for being treated as a threat in my own country, for doing nothing but existing in uniform and in the wrong zip code." The Attorney General interjected. "General, do you believe this incident was racially motivated?" Monroe didn't blink. "I believe Officer Whitmore reacted not to my actions, but to my appearance. I believe she saw my skin before she heard my words. And I believe she did what this country's systems have trained her to do. Act first, justify later." Gasps rippled. Even the Director of Civil Rights leaned forward. "I am not here to simply recount my humiliation," Monroe said, voice rising now, deliberate. "I am here because I want this committee, and this nation, to understand something deeper. I am not fighting to expose a system of discrimination that happens when we resist. I am here to reveal the system that exists even when we comply." The room shifted. The weight of the words sank like iron. That's what America must reckon with. Not the violence that erupts when things go wrong, but the quiet violence that occurs when people like me follow every rule and are still treated like threats. Senator Cross set down his pen. "And what would you say to those who claim this was just one officer's poor judgment?" Monroe looked directly at him. "I would say they are missing the point. This wasn't one bad apple. This was a harvest, and it's time we stop blaming the fruit and start asking what poisoned the soil." Silence. Every official in the room stared at him, not just as a soldier, but as a man who had come prepared not with accusations, but with answers. "Sir," the Director of Civil Rights said softly, "you just changed the nature of this hearing." "No," Monroe replied, "I just reminded it of its purpose." And in that moment, under the sterile light of the Pentagon's most sacred halls, the shift began. Not just in policy, but in perspective. Because the nation wasn't just listening to a general eye. It was hearing a truth that had waited far too long to be said out loud. The screen behind General Elijah Monroe flickered to life with a cold, sterile glow. In a room full of suits, stars, and skepticism, he stood alone, a single figure framed by 4 stars on his shoulder and 20 years of silence now ready to erupt. "I want to be clear," he began, calm as ever. "What happened to me in Ravenwood is not a personal tragedy. It's a statistical inevitability." He pressed the remote. A map of the United States appeared, peppered with glowing red pins, clustered so densely in some states that the lines disappeared beneath them. "In the last 2 decades," Monroe continued, "I've documented over 7,000 racially motivated traffic stops across 47 states. Every pin you see, that's a real person, a real stop, a real story." He turned to face the Senate panel without flinching. "I didn't stumble into this data. I built it by design. I traveled across the country under different aliases, sometimes in uniform, sometimes not. I drove rentals, wore hoodies, wore medals. And what I found was chilling. Uniform or not, skin color was the constant variable. The room had fallen completely still, the kind of stillness right before a storm breaks loose, not of rain, but of truth." He clicked again. Up came graphs, dashboards, body cam transcripts. Patterns so precise they looked engineered, because in a way they were. Engineered not by Monroe, but by a system that had never been held accountable. "What does that mean for us?" he asked. "It means Officer Whitmore didn't fail on her own. She performed exactly as she was trained, by precedent, by policy, and by a nation that's taught its enforcers to fear my skin more than my rank." Gasps. One senator adjusted her glasses, another scribbled notes in a frenzy. "And so," Monroe continued, "I developed something else. Slide. The Monroe Protocol. A simple title. But the bullet points below were anything but ordinary. Implicit Bias Calibration Training, IBCT, mandatory and neuroscientifically verified. Civilian First Encounter Technology, body cams backed by biometric logs. External accountability boards, civilians embedded in use of force reviews. Federalized use of force policy is unified, and there are no more state-by-state loopholes. Automated civilian feedback loops. Every stop generates a real-time report. This isn't a proposal," he said. "It's a system, tested, audited, and already in use across 3 classified military bases as a control group." And then, the moment. An aide entered through the side door, whispering into the ear of the Attorney General, who then opened a sealed envelope with a gold emblem. He looked up, eyes wide. "The President," he said slowly, "has just signed an emergency directive. The Monroe Protocol will be implemented for pilot testing in 5 states." He looked directly at Monroe. "Starting with North Carolina." A collective intake of breath swept across the room. Monroe gave a single nod, not triumphant, measured. Like a man who had just dropped the first domino after spending decades lining them up. One of the senators leaned in, her voice quiet. "Did you expect this outcome?" "No," he said. "But I engineered the opportunity for it, because that's what you do when you've spent a lifetime surviving a system. You don't just speak out, you build its replacement." Another senator asked, "And what of Officer Whitmore?" He turned toward the question, not with anger but with something more cutting, clarity. "She is not the disease," he said. "She is a symptom. Let her be the first beneficiary of the very training she never knew she needed." In that room, justice didn't shout. It presented, it documented, it reformulated the entire conversation. And as General Monroe walked out of the Pentagon that day, escorted not by guards but by colleagues, the news had already broken. The Monroe Protocol, born from injustice, built for transformation. Because some arrests shatter dignity, but others, they rebuild nations. The ceremony had ended, the applause had faded, but the reckoning remained. In the quiet hallway outside the auditorium, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. General Elijah Monroe stood beside a glass display case lined with the original drafts of the Monroe Protocol and plaques honoring civil rights trailblazers. At the center, a folded American flag and a single pair of handcuffs, twisted open. He turned as footsteps approached. Sophia Whitmore, formerly Officer Karen Whitmore, walked slowly toward him. Her uniform now bore a different insignia: National Instructor for Ethical Policing Civilian Rights. Her badge, no longer a symbol of unchecked power, had become something more difficult to carry: accountability. She stopped a few feet away, unsure of how to begin. "You asked to see me, sir?" she said quietly. Monroe didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. He opened it slowly and revealed a badge, faded brass, time-worn, but unmistakable. "This," he said, "belonged to the man who arrested my father." Sophia's eyes widened. "He never knew the weight he carried," Monroe continued. "He never got the chance to acknowledge the harm he caused. But you do." He held the badge out to her, not as a gift, not as a punishment, but as a charge. Sophia hesitated. Then I accepted it with both hands, eyes lowered. "I don't know if I deserve this," she whispered. "It's not about what you deserve," Monroe said. "It's about what you do next." He stepped back. "You will carry this badge with you, not to wear, but to show, in classrooms, in precincts. In auditoriums like this one, you will tell the story, your story, of what you did, what you failed to see, and what does it cost?" She nodded, barely able to speak. "Because repentance is not enough," he said. "You must become a messenger." Across the country, the ripple had already begun. The video of Monroe's arrest, the shove against the hood, the refusal to check his credentials, the handcuffs clinking over a 4-star general's wrists, had been designated mandatory teaching material for all police academies under federal oversight. Cadets were no longer shown abstract warnings about bias. They were shown reality. They showed her. Sophia would now tour the nation, not as a defendant, but as a mirror, a living lesson, a warning, and perhaps a redemption. In one training session months later, she would stand in front of 300 recruits and say, "I thought I was doing my job, but I wasn't protecting anyone. I was protecting a system that didn't ask me to think, just to act. I arrested a man I didn't see, and that man showed me the cost of blindness." Back in the hallway, Monroe stared out a window as the sun began to set behind the Capitol dome. Sophia stood beside him, the old badge clutched in her hand. "General," she said softly, "why me?" He turned to her, tired perhaps but unwavering. "Because the ones who break the chain must be the ones who help mend it." A long silence passed between them. And then, just before he walked away, he added, "Sometimes the greatest revolution comes from the voice of the one who nearly destroyed it." In homes, classrooms, and precincts across America, one story echoed louder than any order barked through a megaphone. You cannot arrest truth, but truth can arrest you, and if you're lucky, it will teach you how to rebuild. A handshake can't erase a mistake, but it can begin a journey of repair. And sometimes, the one who once erred becomes the spark that lights a generation, to see, to understand, to change. If the story of General Elijah Monroe moved you, if you believe that justice is not silence, but intelligent action, then don't let this message stop here. Share this video because someone out there needs to see themselves in this truth. Leave a comment, because every voice is a brick in rebuilding trust. and hit subscribe so we can keep telling the untold stories of courage, reckoning, and an America learning how to do right again. Don't just watch. Speak up because change starts with you.